neighbor's plant. It's not yours. Okay. Oh, it's just a theoretical. That's even better. A theoretical way. We might look. That's Japanese ligustrum back over there, and you know, so when we didn't plant those, whoever planted them probably didn't know they were going to get that big, and they want them smaller. Well. And we can't go through and just cut this overgrown plant back, or we're going to take off 99% of the foliage, which may cause it to stay too wet and die. So how do we reduce the size of that spindly, leggy, overgrown plant? Well, in most cases, we will simply do it in 2 or sometimes even 3 stages. Now, that does not mean that if it's this tall and we want it this tall, we cut it back up here this year and then we cut it down here next year. No, that's not going to work. And some plants, you simply can't dwarf them. I mean, if you want a 4-foot hedge and you've planted photinias, you go ahead and rip those things out and plant something else, because you'll never keep a healthy photinia hedge at 4 feet. You know, you wanted a poodle and you got a Great Dane, give that dog to somebody else and go buy yourself a poodle. You're never going to stunt that animal and keep it small. But what you do with your overgrown plant, let's say that ligustrum, or in the case of the front of my house, my boxwood or whatever, let's say that plant has 8 big trunks coming up and they're all bare down at the base. What I'm going to do is go through and take 4 of those trunks and cut them down low. And then I'm just going to not even worry about the rest of the tall, spindly growth. But those 4 trunks that I cut down to a lower level, what's going to happen? They're going to all of a sudden branch out and start putting lots of new growth out on that cut point, right? As soon as I have a reasonable amount of foliage down low on those 4 trunks that I cut off, I'm going to cut the other 4 off. Doing it in 2 stages. Now, if it's a slow-growing plant, many years ago, back when, long before we had shades of green, and I was out pruning in people's yards for $1 an hour, a lady down in Almost Park had some badly overgrown azaleas. Azaleas were so slow growing, had to cut them back one spring and go back the next spring and make the second cutting on them. Something fast growing, well, maybe we make our first cutting back of it now and we do the second time the 1st of June or something like that. But it all goes back to the principle that I was telling you. You've got to have the foliage on there to get rid of that excessive moisture. So we can't cut them back all at one time. We simply cut back half of the long limbs, and then as soon as it starts growing and filling out further down in the plant, then we'll go cut the other 4 back, and all of a sudden we've got a nice, bushy, smaller plant. And we tell our neighbor not to let that happen again, to prune every year to keep it down to the size that you like. But that, in general, is how you go about pruning back overgrown shrubs. A little bit of an oversimplification, but if you follow that principle, you will not go wrong. Now let's talk about special cases. I'm going to talk about crepe myrtles, going to talk about nandinas in particular. Nandinas are such gorgeous plants. I wish they were grown more widely. But the nandina that my grandmother grew was the old-fashioned one they called heavenly bamboo. And if you've ever seen an old-fashioned heavily bamboo hedge, it's like this tall, and it's nothing but bare stems all the way down below. And when you cut them back, they may branch out a little bit, but they don't, you know, put on a full bunch of growth. So what are we going to do with nandinas? Nandinas, I like to prune on what I would call a 3-year cycle. And that is, if I've got a big nandina hedge, this year I'm going to go through and I'm going to take 1/3 of the tallest canes on there. And I'm going to cut them down to about 4 inches tall. Now those that I cut down to about 4 inches tall are going to sprout out and begin growing. The rest of them are going to keep on growing as if I haven't pruned at all. Next year I will go through and I will cut out 1/3 of the tallest canes. By that point the ones I cut last year are this tall, so I've got another set that are this tall, plus the ones that were full size. Next year I'll take 1/3 of the tallest canes out and I will cut them down, and the process continues. By the following year, I'll be cutting back those that I cut back the first time around. I'll be cutting those back. So I'm on a 3-year cycle, and I've got, you know, some growth here, some growth here, and some growth here, and I've got a real full and pretty hedge. So nandinas are a special case. Cut back 1/3 of the tallest canes every year, and you will be doing just fine on those.
When?
Right now. Just as soon as the growth is about to begin, as soon as the bud starts to swell. Crepe myrtles are a special case. There are 3 general groups of crepe myrtles. There are miniature crepe myrtles that grow 2 to 4 feet in height. There are dwarf crepe myrtles that grow 4 to 7 feet in height. And there are standard crepe myrtles that get bigger. If you want the biggest example, go down here at the end of the street and look at the Basham Party Pink that they planted. They're about 30 feet tall. In Houston, they probably grow 40 feet tall. If you want a 6-foot crepe myrtle and you planted Basham's Party Pink, you dig them up and give them to somebody else, and you go back and plant a crepe myrtle that is the appropriate size. But once again, you can't make, a Great Dane into a Schnauzer. You got to have things that at maturity will be about the size you want. But the pruning on crepe myrtles can be divided into really 2 general things. Do you want them bushy? Do you want them tree form? If you want them bushy, then you tend to trim back the tops and make them stay full all the way down through, like we're talking about this kind of shrub. If you want them tree form, you keep cutting the lower growth out. Now, I always like to have at least 3 trunks on a tree form crepe myrtle. There's some of them a little further up here you can look at if you want. The reason I don't like a single trunk crepe myrtle is because crepe myrtles are relatively brittle. And you got 1 trunk, you got all this foliage up on top, we have a bad ice storm and the thing snaps out, you got nothing left. You have 3 or 4 or 5 trunks coming up and all this foliage up on top. One of those trunks snaps and breaks, you still got the other 3 or 4 there, and 6 months from now you'll hardly even miss the one that was damaged. Same thing goes for mountain laurel, same thing goes with lots of other things. So the question then becomes, we've got a mature crepe myrtle, and we don't want to do what whoever was asking about, where you've just gone through and lopped it off and made this little bird's nest of growth up on top. You treat it just like we talked about on the pecan tree. You've got this tall stem coming up. If we just cut it at this point, we're going to get that little bird's nest of growth. But if we have another limb that's starting to come off this way, we cut it right above that limb. Got another limb coming off here, would rather have it going that way, we cut it right above. The general rule on pruning a plant like a crepe myrtle, if you need to reduce the size, cut just above an existing limb. That way, because that thing we talked about, the hormone going up the trunk, the plant's simply going to put its growth effort into making that plant, that branch grow. And then maybe you prune it a second time up above a higher limb, to change the shape of it a little bit. But the worst thing you can do is just lop it off and get that bird's nest of growth that you were talking about. Now, if you already have that bird's nest of growth, what do? You go through and you thin out and you take out all except the 1 or 2 of the strongest limbs. Or let's say you have to cut back a tall trunk, there's just nothing coming off of it, so you don't know where to cut it off. Well, you do just like the storm damage somebody asked about on the oak tree. You cut it back to a given point, and then when it starts sprouting out, then you take out all except 1 or 2 or 3 of those little sprouts that are coming out. That way, you can maintain a natural-looking, attractive plant. But in the case of crepe myrtles, I will tell you that most of those plants that are being murdered, the old crepe myrtle we talked about, those were people that planted a variety that was too large. They planted a 20-foot plant when they wanted a 10-foot plant. Deal, number 1, with a good nursery that grows knows how big the crepe myrtle grows. Number 2, deal with the nursery that puts accurate names on its plants. We won't mention any box stores or anybody like that it's pink. I actually saw, crepe myrtles labeled it, one of them won't remain nameless, but, they had a tag on there, and for variety it said pink. That tells me a whole lot about how that crepe myrtle grows. Be sure, you want one grows 15 feet, plant dynamite if you want a red, or better still, plant red rocket. That's going to be a gorgeous 15-foot crepe myrtle. You want a 30-foot crepe myrtle, plant Basham's Party Pink. You want a little dwarf one, plant World's Fair, New Orleans, or one of these little bitty varieties.
We just bought a new home, and the crepe myrtles are already existing, so I don't know what I have. But they've been trimmed back, and they have little knots.